So, today we will be discussing how to solve quadratic equations. So, to start off, what is? What is a quadratic equation? Basically, a quadratic equation is a polynomial with polynomial equation with a degree of 2. What I mean that is just that it's raised to the second power. And so the standard form you'll see is ax squared plus bx plus c, and this has to equal 0 for the standard form. Now, a, b, and c are all stand-ins for constants. In other words, like coefficients. But it's important to know that a cannot equal 0 for the standard form. So there are actually 4 main ways to solve quadratic equations. Now, the most common way is going to be by factoring, and we'll look at this. The second way is going to be by using the quadratic formula. And we'll show examples of that. And then our third way is going to be by completing the square. And finally, our fourth way is just going to be by graphing it. Now, I'm not going to show you in this video how to graph it, but you can plug you can plug the equation into your calculator, however your calculator looks, and you can just graph it that way, or you can manually graph it by, doing your x and y and then plugging in values here and then finding what is equal to make your line. Okay, so our first way we're going to talk about is by factoring, right? So our steps for this is you're going to want to rewrite the equation in standard form. The second, you're going to factor the quadratic expression. And third, you're going to set the factors equal to 0. And then by doing this, you're just going to solve for x. So let's go through with an example. Let's say that we have x squared minus 5x plus 6 equals 0. So this is our standard form where this would be our a, and then this is our b, and that is our c. Now the coefficient a just equals 1 since there is no actual number here, but if this was, let's say, 2x, then then a would equal 2. So for this, you want to factor, and so what we want to ask ourselves is what multiplies to get 6 and adds to get negative 5. So in this case, it would be negative 2 and negative 3, because when you add negative 2 and negative 3, you get that negative 5, and when you multiply it, you get a positive 6. So then your factors would be x minus 2 and x minus 3. And we just got to set these equal to 0. So when does x equal 0 in these cases? X equals 0 at positive 2 and positive 3. Therefore, our answers are x equals 2 and x equals 3. So those ones are pretty straightforward. Let's move on to using the quadratic formula. So the quadratic formula states that x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And this is where, from our standard form, this is where our a's, our b's, and our c's come into play. You don't really see it a whole lot coming into play during factoring, but this is why the quadratic formula was kind of made. So let's go ahead and do an example, right? So let's say we have 2x squared minus 4x minus 6 equals 0. So our first step is going to be to identify these coefficients, right? So here, 2 is our A, negative 4 is our B, and negative 6 is our C, because if we go back to the standard form, that's where those all lie, right? So scroll back down here. We know that A equals 2, B equals negative 4, and C equals negative 6. So now we just need to plug these into our quadratic formula. So if you forget what that is, it's this equation right here. So by doing this, we are going to get, change the color here, we're going to get that x equals minus negative 4 plus or minus the square root of negative 4 squared minus 4 times 2 times negative 6, all divided by 2 times 2. I'm going to slowly just break this down. So then x equals 4 plus or minus the square root of 16 plus 48 all over 4. And then x equals 4 plus or minus the square root of 64, which actually turns out to be a perfect square. And so our final answer, well, not very final, but 4 plus or minus 8 over 4. And so we see that this plus or minus right here, it just means that there are two possible answers, because whenever you have a square root, there could be a negative or there could be a positive version, right? So we have to solve for that. So if we have 4 plus 8 divided by 4, that's going to equal 3. So here's one of our answers. But then we also have to take into account 4 minus 8 over 4, which turns out to be negative 1. And that is our second answer. So now moving on to our third way to solve quadratics, and that is by completing the square. Oh, I so spelled that wrong. Oh my gosh. Square, right? So we have two steps for this one as well. One, we want to rewrite the equation but specifically in the form of x plus p squared that equals q. And so you might be wondering, okay, well, where did this p and where this q come from? Well, I'll show you in the example where they come from. And then your second step is just going to be to solve by taking square roots of both sides. Roots of both sides. All right, so let's do an example. So, for example, if we have x squared plus 6x plus 5 equals 0, technically we could solve this through factoring and it would be a lot simpler, but for the sake of completing the square, we're just going to be doing that. So our first step is going to be moving the constant over to the other side. So then you would get x squared plus 6x equals negative 5. For our second step, we want to complete the square by adding and subtracting 6 over 2 squared, which just ends up being 9. Now, you may be wondering, how did we get 6 over 2 in this? So we have the 6 that comes from our b, and our 2 comes from our power. So that's where these came from, and then you just want to square it because we are completing the square. And so what this is going to look like is it's going to turn into x squared plus 6x plus 9 equals 4, because we're also adding 9 to this side. Because what you do to one side, you have to do to the other. So now all that we're left to do Just kidding. So now we can complete the square by noticing that if we do x plus 3 squared, it's just going to equal this polynomial, right? Because if you take x plus 3 and you factor in all of these, then you will end up getting x squared plus 6x plus 9. So now that we have a form that looks like the form we want to get into, the x plus p squared equals q. Now we just have to solve. And how we solve is going to be like kind of like our quadratic formula, right? So we're going to have x plus 3. And again, since this is squared, we have to square root both sides. So now what we have is we have x plus 3 equals plus or minus 2. So now to solve for x, you're going to have either x plus 3 equals positive 2 and x plus 3 equals negative 2. Then you just want to subtract 3 on both sides, and your final answer you'll end up getting is x equals negative 1 and x equals negative 5. So, like I said, I'm not going to be showing how to graph it, since you can plug it into your calculator or use graphing paper just by plugging in x's and getting your y's and graphing it that way. But altogether, we found that solving quadratic equations can be used in a number of ways. Some of the most common ways that you'll see is by factoring or using the quadratic formula. However, also completing the square is an option, but most of the time you can just factor it instead of completing the square, and it will save you a lot of time.